Welcome to Energy Tracker Asia, where we explore the trends and transformations shaping the region's energy future. In today's episode, we turn our focus to the Philippines, a country at a crossroads in its energy journey. While the government has set clean energy goals, its continued investment in imported liquefied natural gas, or LNG, raises serious questions. What are the real costs of this reliance, and what policy shifts are needed to achieve in a truly just and inclusive energy transition? Joining us today is Joel Chester Cheng Pagulayan, the Climate Justice Portfolio Manager at Oxfam Pilipinas. Cheng is a leading advocate in the field of climate justice, energy transition, and LGBTQIA+ rights, and he is also at the forefront of shaping how climate and energy policy can be more equitable and people-centered. Hi Chang, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
All right, so let's begin by setting the context. Where does the Philippines currently stand in terms of its energy mix, and what trends have you observed in recent years?
Yeah, as of 2023, based from our Philippine Department of Energy's data, over 62% of our power generation mix still comes from coal, where around 14% from fossil gas and only a small portion uh, from renewables, 22% combined from hydro, geothermal, solar, and wind. And despite, having a national renewable energy program, what we see is a mismatch, between the rhetoric and the reality that we live in. And that the Department of Energy continues to approve fossil gas projects, including over 10 proposed LNG terminals. And instead of, just phasing out fossil fuels, we're building long-term, dependence and reliance on them.
I see. Those numbers really put things into perspective. It's clear that despite promising policy, the actual trajectory tells a different story, and it's a concerning one as well. So let's dig deeper into one of the more controversial pillars of that trajectory, which is LNG. The government often frames LNG as a more cleaner, more reliable bridge fuel. But in your view, is it accurate or is it a distraction?
Yeah, for me, it's really a dangerous distraction. LNG may emit, less carbon dioxide than coal, but it comes with other major issues, like high methane emissions, like volatile global prices and long-term infrastructure lock-in. And LNG is not, a bridge that, as they say, a bridge without a clear bridge or transition timeline. As it looks now, it's more of a barrier. And it really delays real investments in solar, in wind, in grid upgrades, and for frontline communities, impacted by the climate crisis, it creates more risks, from coastal displacements to air quality deterioration. That's why our campaign at Oxfam, alongside other civil society groups, actually challenges greenwashing and also calling for a moratorium on new LNG infrastructure.
I see, I see. But I also believe that's a very strong and important framing as well. LNG, it's not just a stepping stone, but as a stumbling block. And it's striking how that disconnect between policy narratives and lived impact plays out, right? So when it comes to shifting that narrative, what role do policy frameworks currently play to guide the Philippines' energy transition? And where are they falling short from your point of view?
Yeah, we do have, really strong policies on paper. We are touted as a very policy rich and but implementation for a country with the Renewable Energy Act, the climate change law, and other, and our nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, under the Paris Agreement are actually quite ambitious. But implementation is poor, and not enough resources were put in. And there's no binding timeline to phase out fossil gas. Energy planning is heavily influenced by private sector interest, And with no minimal space for community consultations, we've seen how this played out, in the Philippine Energy Plan of 2023 to 2050, where they make very optimistic assumptions about fossil gas growth without fully accounting for the economic burden and climate risks. And that's where the real gap lies, accountability on inclusivity and on equity.
Yeah. You have really hit the nail on the head there. So policy without accountability is just paper. And when communities are left out of the process, it becomes even harder to build trust or momentum, right? So who are the key players shaping these policy, and how does this shape outcomes currently?
Yeah, currently, I mean, primarily it's the Department of Energy that's leading the charge. But of course, big business conglomerates like First Gen and San Miguel, to name a few, and other international financiers also play a big part. Their influence really leads to energy strategies that prioritize more profit and reliability over justice and sustainability. And civil society voices, especially those from the youth, women, farmers, fisher folks, and indigenous communities, are often sidelined. That's why our work really tries to rebalance that by pushing for participatory policymaking and just transition frameworks, that include those most impacted by the climate crisis and energy transition projects.
I see. Thanks, Cheng. I think that's a very powerful breakdown. It really highlights the imbalance between corporate interests and community voices. Let's say for everyday Filipinos, how does this LNG heavy direction impact their daily lives?
Yeah, really. First, the very gut issue, really close to the issues are through electricity prices. LNG imports are dollar priced. So when global markets spike, so do our electricity bills. And second, public funds are being channeled into fossil infrastructure instead of social services that we really need, especially in the context of a developing country. And finally, the risks aren't just financial. LNG terminals pose threats to fishing livelihoods, coastal ecosystems, and public health. And these burdens are not theoretical. It's being felt right now by communities, especially in Batangas, in the Verde Island Passage, and other proposed terminal sites, in the country.
I see. So, environmentally speaking as well, what are the specific climate risks we are inviting by going down this LNG heavy path?
Yeah, aside from carbon dioxide, LNG has a serious methane problem. I think I've mentioned this earlier, where methane is 80 times more potent or stronger than CO2 over 20 years. And we're importing a fuel with massive climate impacts. Well, branding it as clean, that's misleading, that's counterproductive, and frankly dangerous, in a country that ranks among the most climate vulnerable in the world. We are, 16 for 16 consecutive years ranked as the most climate vulnerable.
Yeah, I also think that's a very dangerous and alarming truth, especially given the Philippines' vulnerability to climate change.
Yeah.
So let's shift to the idea of a just transition. Where does that look like in the Philippine context?
Yeah. For the Philippines, just transition really means people and planet over profit. And it means, retraining fossil fuel workers for renewable jobs. It means centering indigenous land rights in energy development. It also means, including women, queer voices in decisions, not as tokens, but also, leaders in their own rights. It means protecting our ecology and biodiversity from further damages, brought about by the climate crisis. And Oxfam, supports grassroots networks that are pushing for energy democracy, where communities have control over their own power generation and their natural resources, and that's the future, that we're fighting for.
I see. Could you also share a few stories or example of what this looks like on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. In our experience working in the different communities, for example, in Negros Islands and in Camarines Norte, youth and farmers have pushed for solar cooperatives. So they manage their own energy systems. In Laguna, where fisherfolk groups are developing their alternative development agenda for fisherfolk and communities to assert their rights, versus a floating solar power facility being put up in the Laguna Lake. In Palawan, indigenous groups have resisted extractive energy projects and demanded for free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. And these are not just protests; they're proposals, they're models, for alternative systems, and we need to scale those models up.
Very inspiring, and I think it's also a great reminder that solutions are already out there. They just need
Yeah.
support and if you had the chance to implement the three policy changes tomorrow, from your experience, what would
Mhm.
they be?
Yeah, firstly, at the policy level, maybe an immediate, moratorium on new LNG terminals and fossil fuel subsidies, and a clear and equitable fossil phase out plan. Because we're not seeing that right now in our policies. And second, aggressive investment in community-owned renewable energy backed by national funds, because I think the communities have an idea how important renewables are, but lacking resources. And thirdly, establish a just transition commission or any similar multi-stakeholder body with real representation, from trade unions, from labor unions, women's groups, indigenous leaders, and impacted communities. These are feasible steps if there's political will, and we're seeing this from different contexts in different countries, with similar circumstances.
I see. Thanks for sharing your point of views. I think it's very clear, actionable, and urgently needed as well. That roadmap actually makes the path forward feel more achievable. And
Mhm.
then and finally, for young Filipinos listening to our podcast right now, what can they do to support or get involved in this movement?
Yeah, I think for me, it worked, by starting to educate myself and others, join something or build something, out of curiosity, whether it's a school campaign or maybe a community energy audit or advocacy online. Your voice is needed. We need more allies, in those spaces. And the climate crisis is more than just, an environmental issue. It's also a political issue. It's personal because it affects us, and it needs collective effort from everyone, from all of us, really.
That's such a compelling call to action. Your voice are needed. So climate justice isn't about policy, it's about people finding their power and using it. So before we wrap up, Cheng, what's one thing you hope our listeners will take away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I hope, people understand that the energy transition issue isn't just about, shifting technologies. It's all about human rights. It's all about justice, that every peso that the government, or we invest in, every policy that our policymakers pass, should move us closer to a system that serves us, people, but not just profits, And we have a choice, continue down the costly path of LNG and fossil dependency, or commit to a future that's clean, that's inclusive, that's community led. And that choice isn't just for policymakers, it's for all of us, And change starts when we demand better policies and better actions from our duty bearers.
Thank you, Chang. That's a very powerful reminder. that every policy choice is a reflection of our priorities, and that people must be at the center of this transition. This has been a very incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise, your advocacy, and your vision for a just energy future in the Philippines.
Yeah, thank you too. It's really been a pleasure to be part of this important dialogue from Energy Tracker Asia.
And thank you to everyone tuning in. If you found this episode meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Energy Tracker Asia for more discussion on the energy transition across the region. For deeper insight, campaign updates, and analysis, visit our website at energytracker.asia. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for change.